Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the 9th Biennial Winter Wildlands Alliance Grassroots Advocacy Conference. This is a recorded version of our live conference, which happened yesterday. So this is sort of virtual upon virtual, but for the only technical glitch we had over the course of 2 days is we lost about the first 10 minutes of the recording on this panel, which is the panel discussing the funding issues faced by the Forest Service. So I'm going to reconstruct my introduction, and I'm going to have my policy colleague Hillary Eisen speak to some of the on-the-ground situation, and then we'll splice that onto the recording from yesterday. So enjoy. First of all, I'm David Page. I'm the Advocacy Director for Winter Wildlands Alliance. I'm based in Mammoth Lakes, California, Payahunadu, which is the current and traditional homelands of Paiute and Shoshone peoples. Winter Wildlands Alliance is based officially in Boise, Idaho, which is the territory of the Shoshone and Bannock peoples. Hillary Eisen, who is on screen with me here, is based in Bozeman, Montana, and it's too complex of a land acknowledgement for me to do. I don't know, Hillary, if you want to talk to us about all the various peoples that have passed through Bozeman in the last 10,000 years.
I don't know about 10,000 years, but yeah, the Gallatin Valley's historically been sort of an area in the land that has been home to and traveled through by at least 20 different indigenous nations. It was in the sort of territory of the Blackfeet people, but others, including the Bannock, the Crow, the Flathead, the Nez Perce, and the Shoshone, also traveled through on a regular basis. And of course, people from those communities continue to live and work here today.
Right, and all the way back to the Fremont culture way before that. Anyway, great, thanks. Winter Wildlands Alliance is a national nonprofit organization. We're a coalition of 32 different grassroots groups nationwide. We work to educate, inspire, and empower people to take care of their public lands, our public lands, and wild winter landscapes. We run a snow school program that has 70 sites across the country and works to get about 35,000 kids out on snow every winter, mostly underserved kids from public school districts. We run an annual backcountry film festival, which in normal times tours around 100 plus cities and towns, really across the world. Many of you have probably attended it. It's a really great gathering of folks, great place for communities to come together and get the stoke on for the upcoming season or the season underway. Last year, because of COVID, we went almost entirely virtual. It's really an important fundraising tool for our grassroots groups. This year, it sounds like it's going to kind of be a hybrid, with some virtual screenings available, and also hopefully in some places where folks are hardy, we'll do some outside screenings. So certainly track our channels to find out where a screening near you will be. The content is always great fun. All of our work depends on our membership. So please, if you're a member, thank you very much. If you're not a member, please do go to our website, winterwildlandsalliance.org, and join us. We have a terrific new membership director, Kate Thorpe, who will be thrilled to hear from you and interact with you. The theme of the conference this year, and the conference we do every 2 years, by the way. Normally we don't do it virtually, so we're hoping that in a couple of years we'll have our public health issues wrangled and be able to meet again in person, hopefully maybe in the Pacific Northwest, so stay tuned for that too. But this year we're talking about, can we save the backcountry from ourselves, essentially looking at issues around increasing visitation, and both the opportunities and the challenges presented by the increasing numbers. We've had some terrific conversations around etiquette, personal responsibility, messaging, around winter travel planning, snow rangers, trail hosts, and other Forest Service partnership programs. We've talked with athlete influencers about the role of social media. We've talked about ski area expansions, really terrific discussion on that. And this panel will be talking about funding for the Forest Service. All of those panels are recorded, and this is the only one that had a bit of a glitch. So please check our website. You've probably already seen. Those recordings are great. You can listen to them as a podcast. Please share them with your colleagues and friends. Really, really fascinating set of people talking about a lot of things that impact our winter recreation experiences. So just quickly, I want to do a public lands acknowledgement. We're talking about public lands throughout these conference panels. I think it's important for us to acknowledge the tragic, long tragic history of these places. You know, people have been living in and recreating on and depending on these landscapes and ecosystems for thousands of years. I was just doing some rereading about Teddy Roosevelt and the establishment of the Forest Service. And while, you know, we have, I think we are the envy of the world in terms of our public land system and the amount of land we have protected. Most of that land, if not all of it, was secured at gunpoint in the name of the United States of America. People were massacred and driven off. I bring that up just because I think it really reinforces how incumbent it is on us as contemporary citizens in a democracy to participate in the management of these lands and the stewardship, and making sure that there's equitable access for all people to these lands. So without further ado, I want to, in the panel yesterday, we had a chance for the speakers to introduce themselves, but really an illustrious panel today, terrific stuff. We have Betsy Roblee, who is the Conservation and Advocacy Director for the Mountaineers. She's based up in Seattle, I believe. And we have Mike Splain, who's the Conservation Funding Project Manager for Resources Legacy Fund. So he's working on a project really directly addressing the funding issues of the Forest Service, so has a lot of good things to say. We also are really pleased to have Erin Uloth, who's the Budget and Program Development Director for the Pacific Southwest region of the Forest Service here, Region 5 in California, where I am. And she really breaks down in a fascinating and digestible way how the budgeting works at the regional and federal level for the Forest Service. So the little piece of Betsy Roblee's introduction that got cut off, Betsy and Hillary worked on a white paper for Outdoor Alliance that's really a terrific resource, and you can find that resource on our website. But really digging into, you know, what are the chronic funding issues and how do they impact the management of recreation and the health of ecosystems. And so, Hillary, if you could just give us sort of a, you know, 3 to 5 minute introduction on kind of the state of funding, you know, kind of how we got to where we are and what, less how we got to where we are, but really what is the situation? I mean, I've got some numbers from the Department of Agriculture. I mean, the scope of what the U.S. Forest Service does and manages is enormous. 193 million acres, which is more land mass than all of the country of France. 27 million annual visits to ski areas on national forests, 122 ski areas, 154 different national forest units, 4,300 campgrounds, on and on. By the Department of Agriculture's numbers, the Forest Service contributes $13 billion every year to the U.S. economy and visitor spending. If I got this right, the numbers for fiscal year 22, 8.4 billion in appropriations, which is, you know, less, 8.4 billion in appropriations versus 13 billion in visitor spending. Just by contrast, NASA gets $29 billion. Department of Energy gets 64 billion. Department of Defense, of course, 1.4 trillion. So many thousands of times more than our Forest Service gets. But maybe you can talk to us just about what those funding shortages look like over the years.
Yeah, happy to do that and hopefully can recreate the introduction that Betsy did so well yesterday. And you already gave a bunch of the stats, so I won't repeat those. But of those 154 national forests and across those 193, I think, million acres, we've seen significant reduction in capacity over the last 20 years or so. The Forest Service's budget has remained flat, but what we're asking of them has increased steadily. Not, of course, a large part of this is because of wildfire. Our wildfires on national forest lands have grown considerably. The wildfire season is longer and more intense than it's ever been before, and that takes a lot of resources. But we also have seen huge increases in recreation. We also, ask the Forest Service to manage wildlife habitat, to protect habitat for many different species, from game species to endangered species. Many treasured waterways flow through national forest lands, a lot of which provide water to the municipal community, or municipal water to the communities downstream from the forest. And so it's a huge ask that we ask the agency to do, but with a flat budget over all of that time and ever increasing demand, what you have is an agency trying to do more with less. And so just to add to the numbers that you threw out there earlier, we've seen since the early 1990s a significant reduction in staffing across all programs at all levels of the agency except for wildland firefighting. And so, for example, in 1992, or since 1992, there's a 27% reduction in fisheries biologists, a 38% reduction in wildlife biologists, and a 49% reduction in forestry technicians, which is the category that includes, among other things, seasonal trail crew members. Of course, if you have 49% fewer technicians out there to do the work, you're certainly not able to do the same amount of work that you could accomplish with more staff. As outdoor recreationists, we've all seen the effects of this on the ground, from trails that don't get maintained as frequently as they once were, to campgrounds that are closed for safety reasons, to an difficulty as a nonprofit organization, difficulty partnering with the Forest Service. Even when an organization wants to help the Forest Service increase their capacity, sometimes the agency doesn't have a staff member who can actually work with partners to take advantage of volunteer resources. We also have seen this capacity challenge affect the agency's ability to do restoration activities. Their restoration, watershed, and recreation budgets have decreased by nearly 40%, or numbers, not budgets, have decreased by nearly 40%. In 1998, there's about 18,000 people in the Forest Service working on those programs, and in 2015, it was fewer than 11,000. I've also seen considerable consolidation across the forest. So my sort of backyard national forest here in Bozeman is the Gallatin, but recently, within the last 10 years, it became the Custer Gallatin, because you went from having the Custer National Forest and the Gallatin National Forest to the Custer Gallatin National Forest. By merging the two forests, you went from having two forest supervisors to one forest supervisor, two biologists to one biologist, all, kind of shrinking and shrinking. Again, a great sort of example of how the agency is attempting to do more with less. And the members on this panel will get into all of this in a lot of detail. And so I think I'll just turn it back over to Betsy and Mike and Erin from here.
Great. Thanks, Hillary.
All the reasons why groups like the Mountaineers, Winter Wildlands Alliance, and Outdoor Alliance, which we're both a part of, we're all asking Congress for really a much more stronger investment in the Forest Service and other land management agencies. That's why we put together the white paper, which I think Melinda's going to drop in the chat. And I'll go into a little bit more specifics about what we're asking for, and specifically what the solutions are and what you can help with in a little bit, but I'll stop there and let maybe Mike continue on to how this shows up for different organizations on the ground.
Great, thanks, Betsy. It's a terrific introduction. Yeah, and I see that link went up in the chat. Also, so that you know, in the audience, Melinda will also follow up with an email afterwards and with a survey and some further resources for discussion. So Mike, based on that sort of high level picture, you know, before you worked for RLF, you worked with an organization that partnered on a specific national forest unit. Maybe you can just sort of bring that down to the ground and talk about how funding impacts things at the local level.
I'll try not to go on forever. Thanks. So before RLF, I spent almost 2 decades in the trenches. You know, it wasn't that bad, but I really did everything from stuff envelopes to serve as executive director for Ventana Wilderness Alliance, which is, you know, an advocacy and stewardship group working on the Big Sur backcountry in the Los Padres National Forest on the central coast of California. So in my early years at VWA, we were shepherding a bill that would add about 50,000 acres of wilderness. It would basically make the Ventana the most expanded unit in the National Wilderness Preservation System. So miraculously, in the Congress passed it, and in the 11th hour, George W. Bush signed the bill into law. And so, of course, we did our own little obligatory mission accomplished celebration and just assumed that all the hard work was done. And boy, were we wrong when we took a look around and realized how understaffed that unit was. So it had already been years since our ranger district had any field staff or even a trail crew. Soon the rec officer retired, no one replaced him. Next, the wilderness manager retired, no one replaced him. So just to meet the basic needs of a landscape that got national park level visitation and had about 300 miles of trails, VWA launched our own volunteer trail crew and even trained a corps of volunteer wilderness rangers to meet the public, because there was a lot of public. So still projects would get held up because there weren't the specialists to do the environmental review. So we studied up on NEPA. One of our volunteers got certified to use the Forest Service computer system. We recruited botanists, biologists, archaeologists to help with field surveys. We fundraised to, you know, hire a firm to do a management plan. I could go on and on. Frankly, we did a lot of things that volunteers and partners are not supposed to do. And it's not, I'm not, you know, faulting the Forest Service for this. They just did not have the manpower. So just before I departed, the assistant recreation officer retired, and the district ranger took a 3-month detail to another forest. So I've seen the org chart, and there are 6 wilderness and rec positions on that unit. And when I left, there were 0 filled. So literally no one was minding the store. And over the course of my time there, the Monterey Ranger District, as it was called, it endured really a litany of anthropogenic wildfires, 2 set by illegal campfires, 1 that was associated with a trespass cannabis grow site we had reported to law enforcement a year before, and nobody to deal with it. So minimal boots on the ground really would have averted about over 300,000 acres of destruction that wiped out 70 homes and a California condor sanctuary, including the death of 11 endangered condors. So, you know, I could go on and on, like I said, but no, it really would have been.
I think you've painted a good bleak picture that I think we all can relate to on our own units.
Yeah.
So with that in our minds, I'm going to switch over to Erin. You know, looking at an actual budget, let's dive in a little bit to the brass tacks here of how are how are these Forest Service budgets put together from your vantage? You know, what are the issues? What's going on?
Thanks, Dave. So there's a lot I could speak to on this. So I'm gonna dance around a little bit. I want you guys to walk away with sort of 3 things in mind, and I'm gonna try to illustrate that. One is that the budget process is a complicated dance with a lot of players, and timing matters. So lots of players and timing is a piece of the puzzle. Another thing I want you to walk away knowing is that the budget is very interconnected, right? So pulling on one thing can have impacts in other places. So that's another piece that's important to understand. And then the third is that we have seen major changes over time. Betsy outlined some of those. Mike was living them. We have more coming. with the infrastructure bill and the changes in the omnibus bill that are coming, you know, if those things pass, that's going to present more changes potentially to the agency. So, we're constantly fluid and trying to work with what we've got. But there's been a lot of change over time. And so it's just important to sort of recognize where we are in that flow of time and what's coming and how we can take advantage of the opportunities that might be coming our way. So, the budget process, it's a dance, lots of players and timing matters. And so this is a little bit of a 101. I think you guys probably know a lot of this, but by and large, the budget process involves both the executive branch, which is the agencies and the administration, as well as the legislative branch, Congress. Right now, Congress is in the middle of fiscal year 22 budgeting. We're not engaged in fiscal year 22 budgeting really at this point. We've already done our work with the president's on the president's side. So on the agency side, during formulation, we're working internally to develop our planning that will inform our ask. That goes through our department and then goes into the president's budget, which gets published on February 1st each year, right? So what the Forest Service is requesting comes up through the department and through the president. And then Congress takes it and they kind of look at it and they're like, okay, we'll keep it in mind, but we're going to kind of do what we want to, right? So this is where the different players come in. So they begin their deliberations, each appropriations committee working through markups in the omnibus bill. The budget can get a little bit complicated. We do some back and forth. So our agency, our Washington office level, I work at the regional level. We also have the Washington office level, and they're working to answer questions from Congress that, come in as they continue to go through their markups. But the fiscal year 22 stuff is pretty much on its path. What we're working on right now on the agency side is 23. So that's where the timing piece comes in, where if we have partners who come to us and want to talk to us about what's going on with our budget or whether or not there's a place for folks to engage, right? If you're in a position of wanting to engage with lawmakers, really being aware of where we are in the budget process is going to make a difference. So for instance, we've got a project in California that started probably a couple years ago, and we're just starting to find ways to fund it, right? So it takes some time and it takes some negotiation. It's that dance. So engaging now means looking really at 23. So the other piece of this being interconnected, the Forest Service recently underwent a change in our budget. And so if you really want to get into the dirt with us, which is great, I love it, understanding some of those changes is useful, right? Because then when you come to the table to work with us, you kind of understand what the dynamics are that we're working with. So we've shifted some of the way that we spend money, and we've created sort of new pots of money that are really clear, and they make really transparent what our costs are for doing business. It helps us understand that cost of doing work. We gain some efficiencies in our management, but it has changed the way that we manage our money. So this year has been a transition year. And if you've been working with the Forest Service at all, you may have heard about budget modernization or any changes in the budget. That's what's going on. The ultimate goal of budget modernization is we're really clear about how much our people cost, how much our IT costs, our information technology. We can be really, really clear about how much these things cost, so that when we are continuing to engage with Congress during formulation and planning, with the department, and when Congress is coming back to us asking us how much we need, we can say, well, you know what, this is how much we need for our IT costs. And you can see it in our budget justification this year, where we actually asked for plus ups in our IT budget, because what we got last year was our first year of budget modernization. We're getting a lot clearer on how much our IT costs are in the agency. So there's been some great benefits there. However, there's tension that's been created as well, and this is where the interconnectedness comes in. So we've got these new pots of money, and they're pretty well defined. So if we have this overall top line, say $4 billion in the Forest Service, right? And we say, okay, about $2 billion or $2.5 billion is going towards paying our staff salary. That's what's going towards that. Then we have this left over, right? $1.5 billion, say. I have no idea if that's accurate, but generally speaking, right? Pretend. Well, let's say we want more staff. Okay, well, that has to come out of the program side, right? So we're not going to have as much money to do our contracts or our agreements or buy our materials and supplies. It's a zero-sum game. So that isn't a bad thing. It's just really good and important awareness. And unless we see more money come in overall, we're just making trade-off decisions. And we have seen that, right, happen real time with the agency over time, as we've seen incrementally more effort go into fire. We have had a flat budget for a very long time. So what we've had to do over time in order to manage all the different challenges that we have on our plate is to make those trade-off decisions. So just want to make sure that that understanding is there. That said, the change is coming, right? Change is here. Potentially, we've got new opportunities with infrastructure. The Great American Outdoors Act came through last year. The omnibus bill. I'm going to say that the amount of money that is on the table for those bills is pretty enormous on the scale of ARA or more. That could pose some pretty meaningful amounts of money coming into the agency, depending on how that plays out. So if it plays out, right, and how it plays out could have some real impacts on the Forest Service. And I think there could be some real opportunities for your organizations to engage with us and to help us work through, how we can scale up and really start to meet the needs on the ground differently than we've been doing in the last number of years as we've been managing those trade-offs. So I will pause there and as you guys have questions, I'm sure we'll get to that later, but that's what I wanted to offer up this first
Erin,
round.
thank you. That's just super clear. Terrific overview of how things work. So I'm gonna shift over to Betsy now. Speaking of opportunities, maybe you can sort of give us a high-level overview of what avenues and mechanisms actually exist for trying to improve the funding.
Yeah, absolutely. And Erin really set this up well. So Erin just mentioned the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act last year. That was huge. I mean, the Forest Service has this enormous backlog of deferred maintenance needs. And this is like dedicated funding towards tackling that backlog. And it's a huge win. It's an opportunity for groups like ours to engage with the Forest Service to say, hey, this trail really needs maintenance. It's a super popular trail for climbers and scramblers. Let's get some resources towards it. So that's a great opportunity to work with the Forest Service on these specific projects that are really going to make a difference on the ground. But I'm going to circle back to the big issue that we're talking about here, which is that the Forest Service doesn't have adequate basic staff capacity to administer these funds. So, money to rebuild a trail doesn't do any good if there aren't enough employees to write contracts, to do the environmental analyses and manage the work crews. So, although Great American Outdoors Act is super exciting, really excited about the potential for the upcoming infrastructure and budget reconciliation bills, especially this idea of a civilian climate corps to put people back to work stewarding public lands, to get groups like ours involved on the ground with stewardship. The bottom line that I really want to hammer home is these one-time funding infusions are super helpful and needed, but the long-term solution really is that robust annual funding for the Forest Service. And this is the budget process that Erin talked about. So that's why the main avenue we're targeting for advocacy is increased funding through congressional appropriations. So, each year Congress passes the federal budget. Erin talked about that. Our groups, so Mountaineers, Winter Wildlands Alliance, and Outdoor Alliance recently asked congressional appropriations committees for, I believe it was a 50% increase in funding for Forest Service core operations like recreation staffing, planning, science, infrastructure needs. That sounds like a lot, but as we're talking about today, that's really just the start of what we need to reinvest in the Forest Service. One final aspect of the budget I really want to touch on here is the issue of fire funding that Erin talked about and that zero-sum game. So folks might remember the wildfire funding fix. So over time, fire suppression costs have slowly eaten up the Forest Service budget. So, as Erin mentioned, the budget has stayed flat. Fire costs have risen from about 16% of the budget in 1995 to 52% of the budget in 2015. It got to the point where the agency was forced to borrow money from other priorities like recreation, forest restoration to pay for fire costs. So thanks to a lot of advocacy by a lot of different organizations, Congress passed what's called the wildfire funding fix in 2019, and it created kind of a disaster account to pay for a portion of the firefighting costs, just like hurricanes or floods or disasters, and we pay for that outside of the normal budgeting process. So that was great. It, you know, in my opinion, it really remains to be seen how well this fix is working. Firefighting needs have increased higher than we even expected a few years ago. So even with that additional funding, fire costs are still more than 50% of the Forest Service budget. And then there's this wonky issue that we're kind of watching, which is that the fire funding fix is tied to budget controls that are expiring at the end of this fiscal year 21. So that's something that we're going to be watching closely as well to make sure that this fix is continued into the future.
Great, thanks, Betsy. So we've you've all mentioned appropriations on the one hand. We've got these sort of creative legislative fixes, these new infusions potentially of cash. Mike, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to really dive in a little bit on the appropriations, the normal budgeting process. How does it work, and you know, what are the opportunities for engagement there?
Yeah, and thanks to Erin and Betsy for really kind of, again, setting this up. So as they both mentioned, the Great American Outdoors Act, Land and Water Conservation Fund, and some ledge opportunities can really help get resources to the agency for special projects and backlog. But when it comes to reliable funding, the kind you can actually count on for boots on the ground, we need to consider congressional appropriations. And so, you know, a quick 101, again, it's important to remember there's two types of legislation. There are authorizations and there are appropriations. And since I suffer from CRS, can't remember stuff, I'm going to quote the definition from the CRS, the Congressional Research Service. Authorizations, quote, can establish, continue, or modify an agency program or activity, unquote. So by contrast, appropriations, quote, provide federal agencies legal authority to incur obligations and the Treasury Department authority to make payments, unquote. So in other words, an authorization is nice, but an appropriation provides the funding to make it possible. So Congress has numerous standing committees, but authorizations can come from any of those committees, but appropriations only come from one committee. There's an appropriations committee in each chamber. There are subcommittees within appropriations. Those that are associated with Interior and Environment are the ones looking at the Forest Service budget and examining, as Erin said, you know, when the agency hands over their budget proposal each year, those are the groups that are really drilling down. So these subcommittees, they send the markups to the overarching appropriations committees, which then generate an appropriations bill to fund the Forest Service and, of course, all the other workings of government. So the two bills from the House and the Senate rarely match, and there's lots of wrangling after that to kind of match them up. So I won't get into that here in the interest of time, but the moral of the story is that a relative few members of Congress hold sway over the Forest Service funding, and it's incumbent on those of us who really want to move the needle and influence that to know who they are, and really to get to know them and find out how we can advocate. So I'll leave it there.
Great, and maybe just as a bookmark and a note to Melinda, maybe we should go ahead and put the names of the members of the Appropriations Committee in our little resources email, just so everyone can kind of double check and see if it's somebody in your district. Thanks for that, Mike. I'm going to go back to you, Erin. You've talked a little bit already about kind of the slow, long migration of funding toward wildfire staff and away from all the other staff positions that we need to manage recreation and to, you know, steward the landscapes. As the ship, well, first, I guess, let me just ask, is the ship turning? And if so, you know, what does it look like moving forward for trying to bring some funding back into positions that can allow for volunteer coordination and law enforcement officers and
Right.
archaeologists and all that.
Speaking my love language right now, Dave, just like, let's just list off the litany of all these people I work with every day. Okay, I'm gonna, so let me, there's been a lot of pieces that we've spoken about, so I'm grateful for that, that I can be repeating, and hopefully some of the stuff will resonate with you beyond this. This idea, again, that the Forest Service budget is very interconnected, right? And pulling on one area impacts others. We've talked a lot about fire, and I will talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but I want to name that, you know, we have seen reductions in non-fire staff over time. That when we did a lot of our forest plan revisions, it's like frightening how old some of them are, but you know, like when we did them, we had far more staff, right? So a lot of the regulations and the policies that we want to be living up to are more challenging because we have fewer staff on the ground. There's actually lots of reasons why we've seen a reduction in staff. Fire is a big story, it's very compelling, and it's a big part of it. But I don't want to diminish the like incremental costs that come through every year that do have an impact. So, you know, I love them, but raises, right, for the federal workforce every year, that has to come out of somewhere. When those raises come through, they aren't raising our budget. So paying for raises, paying for cost of living increases. So, you know, in the government, if you're living in San Francisco or in Seattle, you get a cost of living adjustment because the base rate may not necessarily be as much as you probably need to live in that area. So the cost of living changes, right? Those rates change, and that's going to increase over time in a lot of places. There are other costs to government. For instance, this year we thought we were done paying into a retirement fund, but it turns out we have to do some more this year. So there's, and then the cost of doing business has gone up, right? If any of you have tried to build a deck in the last year, you'll know that wood costs went way high, right? Construction costs have gone way high. The demand is up through the roof. And so those costs have gone up. So our ability to, you know, our overall funding levels are impacted by how much it costs for us to do business. How much more technology we use, right? We are investing far more money in information technology than we did 20 years ago. So there are a lot of kind of like these insidious day-to-day things that continue to eat into that budget as well. I was looking at the budget justification. We asked for $10 million more for our non-fire salary to cover our cost of living increases and our retirement contributions alone. So we needed $10 million more just to cover that for this year. And then $5 million more for our increased administrative costs, right? Whether that's janitorial contracts that have gone up or just the cost of the supplies that we need to maintain our buildings. We asked for an additional $21.5 million for IT this year. So those things also eat away. It's not as showy as fire, and it isn't as dramatic of an effect. So we don't talk about it as much, but I wanted to name it, that's still creating some pull in the system. Betsy did name quite a bit about the fire stuff. I don't know that I've got a number of the same statistics lined up for myself to name for you. I don't need to revisit them. But what I want to share maybe is that the fire fix, it essentially freezes us in place around 2015. So the Forest Service budget for wildland fire is kind of around 2015. So we've passed it in 2019, and the fire fix said, okay, well, let's sort of put you back at 2015 and how you funded fire in 2015, which is why we're still kind of over 50%. Because in 2015, we still had seen that incremental shift over time. The way that fire funding has worked in the Forest Service is legislated. It's a 10-year average. So as cost of fire has gone up, we have to shift our funds around to fund fire based on the 10-year average of costs. So when we see those costs skyrocket, we are required, right? We have to shift our funding and our algorithms to fund fire at that level. That's not necessarily as in play anymore because we're frozen at 2015, but because that was going on for so long, we have the staffing we have at this point, and we haven't seen changes, right, in that flat budget to make a shift. So I would say that the fire fix, as an agency person, I want to tell you the fire fix is enormously helpful. It is like absolutely, we were looking for that kind of help for a long time. We were the only agency in the federal government that was responsible for covering all emergency costs for federal emergencies within our own budget. The fact that we don't have to do that now is huge. some of the repercussions, like Betsy was saying, was when we would get into fire season and we would get to a point like where we are now, where our costs exceeded what we had allocated according to the 10-year average, we would have to go back out into our program areas and say, okay, watershed restoration program, how much money have you not spent yet? We need to spend it on fire. Sorry, you can't spend it. You know, okay, recreation, how much money have you not spent yet? In like July, right? In the middle of the field season. And then that money would have to go towards fire. So that was happening. That is no longer happening, but our staffing levels are still pretty much where they were, and they're continuing to be impacted by these costs. So I'm not, I just want to be clear, this is just sort of information, right? I'm not advocating for one thing or another right now. I'm just trying to paint that picture of why we kind of find ourselves in the situation where the fire fix came through and it seemed like maybe, you know, like Mike said, right? You got your wilderness designated and everything should have been unicorns and rainbows. And then you realize, wait, maybe it's not all unicorns and rainbows. There's still more work to do. The fire fix, hugely relieving. And it's sort of like we took away the super, super urgent crisis problem, but it didn't resolve all the problems. We still have things that we need to figure out within our budget system and with fire, the dilemma that is fire, right? The wicked problem that is fire in this country, and how we move forward, you know, collectively on that solution. So I think maybe I'll just pause there, Dave, and just and see what questions folks have.
Great. Yeah, wicked indeed, the fire problem. And it looks like we're going to have some good questions. Before we open it up to questions, I want to go back to Betsy, and then actually I want to give you each a chance, just, you know, kind of a lightning round. Mike mentioned as a point of engagement for advocacy from a stakeholder perspective or from a partner perspective, really getting to know who your members of Congress are and leaning on them and helping to educate them on these issues, really important. Betsy, yeah, what call to action can we leave folks with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we make it really easy for you to just, you know, click an action alert and send a message. And, you know, if you have 2 minutes, that's a great thing to do. If you have 5 minutes, you know, call your member of Congress, email them. If you already have an established relationship, or if you want to establish a relationship with your member of Congress, you can ask for a meeting with their staff. I mean, you can do it virtual, you can do it through Zoom. You don't have to fly to Washington, D.C. and just tell them like, hey, this is a really important issue for me or my organization, and I want to meet with you and get it on your radar screen. I think it's just important to like use all of those levers you can. You know, if you see your member of Congress around town, you know, pester them about this. These issues, especially, you know, funding for outdoor recreation, they often get forgotten. I mean, wildfire is in the news every day now, hugely urgent for sure. There are still members of Congress that seem to, you know, only care about logging revenue, and you need to like raise this on their radar screen. So it's really important that they hear from folks who are out on public lands recreating, who see these impacts. You know, your voice is super powerful. So really encourage you, no matter if your member of Congress is on the appropriations committee or not, they still have influence. So really make sure you're contacting them and getting this front and center.
Absolutely. Great. And again, we'll share resources to help you guys do that. You know, and again, the real complexity of it is that, you know, as Erin alluded to, the agency really can't advocate for its own, for increasing its own budget in the same way that we can as stakeholders. So it's really incumbent on us to follow this and to put pressure where necessary. Mike, any last calls to action that you want to add?
Yeah, I would reiterate, definitely let's share those resources. You guys have such great Winter Wildlands, and the Mountaineers has, you know, such great action alerts. You can just easily do it on the web. But if you're part of a conservation organization, please tell the story. You know, I think it gets lost in the headlines, and most folks don't realize how underfunded the agency really is. And if it's not politically acceptable to give the agency short shrift, that's going to come from people raising hell about it. And then the last little call I'll put in here, if you work with a California organization that has capacity to get involved in this, budget advocacy, we'll call it, please reach out to me directly. I'll put my contact info in the chat. And that's literally what I'm working on right now. So thanks.
Terrific. Great to have you on the project. So I'm going to bring Melinda on to feed us some questions and moderate a little question and answer session. Erin, was there any last thoughts that you can think of or you want to add on the call to action front before we open to questions?
Drink your water. No, I don't think the Forest Service
Unscreening.
does a call to action today.
Yep, great. Go ahead, Melinda.
Okay, well, we have a good amount of questions here. The first one is from Marcus. Basically, Marcus says, do the panel members, non-Forest Service panel members, so that would be Betsy and Mike, think that the non-motorized community should join the motorized community in lobbying for more Forest Service funding? He also adds that in the past, he was rebuffed for proposing this idea to the non-motorized community.
100%, totally. I think, what's really powerful is when groups get together and advocate for the same thing. Even if, you come from really different organizations or different backgrounds or different areas of your state, but you're united around a topic. It's super powerful to members of Congress if they see, a hiker with a, ORV guy and a hunter and, an outdoor recreation business, tribal member, that's a really powerful message that, we all come from different backgrounds, but we're all asking for the same thing. So I'd really encourage folks to find partners on this that maybe wouldn't be your usual folks to go to, and unite and come together and ask for what you need.
Mike, anything you want to add there?
I completely agree. Unlike the allies are a powerful coalition. So
Great, thank you both. The next question is from Sam. Sam says, how are the funds from the Great American Outdoors Act divided up between the various agencies?
you want to take that one, Erin? I could take a stab at it.
I actually don't know. I kind of like live in my Forest Service world in my little bubble, and I don't, I'm also new to this job. So let me also caveat that I'm new to this job. So maybe in another year I'll be able to answer that, but I don't know. I know the Park Service gets more than us. That's all I know.
Yeah, I have the top line numbers. It's
there you go. Thank you.
I think it's up to 1.9 billion a year for 5 years for national parks and other agencies under Department of Interior, and then an additional 600 million per year for 5 years for national forests, BLM lands, and some other agencies. So yeah, national parks get more, unfortunately.
And just as a caveat that's worth mentioning, and correct me if I'm wrong, Erin, but those funds, those numbers seem huge, are still kind of a drop in the bucket for the backlog that we're facing, and also don't cover the staff time required to manage those funds and administer them, right?
Yeah, generally, I mean, I think there's a lot of humanity in Congress where they're human, right? So they want us to spend money on the ground. They don't want to spend it on salary. And so there's caveats around, like, we want this delivered to see impacts on the ground. That's not uncommon for legislation. There's some flexibility in there for us to use it for a little bit of staff time, but it's somewhat restrictive.
Great, thank you all. The next question is from Gail. Besides the Great American Outdoors Act, are there other federal funding sources for federal recreation areas?
Erin, do you think you could take that?
I'm sorry, I need to close the chat because I'm actually looking at the chat. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
No worries. It's the nature of the virtual Zoom conference world. So Gail says, besides the Great American Outdoors Act, are there other federal funding sources for federal recreation areas?
versus, so there's appropriations and GAOA, you know, the CARES Act this last year, the COVID Relief Act, actually went a fair amount of that went towards recreation operations because we were mitigating so much for COVID. We had so many mitigations we had to put into play. And so that supplemented our recreation program a fair amount. But beyond that, you know, I saw Ben Johnson is in the chat, and Ben, if you have anything that you can think of off the top of your head that you could throw in there, that is funding that comes to the agency. I mean, otherwise it's external, right? So a lot of you are maybe partner organizations, and you might enter into agreements with the Forest Service where there's money, right, that you're bringing to the table and matching with us or whatever else. We have a fair amount of work that happens that way. So we do have money that comes in from non-congressional sources, right, that supports our work. And a lot of that can be more clearly directed towards the specific cause and interest of the entities in question.
That's a really important point. I mean, it's an important piece of funding, at least here in Region 5, right, with shared stewardship agreements with the state and Prop 68 money being used to help with recreation management or OSV funds.
Yep, state granting stuff, and the shared stewardship work that we've been doing with the state. There's a lot of money there. Sorry, Mike.
So yeah, other federal dollars will be, you know, Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is primarily for acquisitions. But there's also a pretty decent funding stream coming through grants from National Forest Foundation, which usually require a match, but it is federal money. National Stewardship Alliance, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So, but those really are going to partner orgs to do work on the land. They're not funding the agencies per se.
I see Ben threw something in the chat too about rec fees, which is that's a huge component of how we support our recreation funding, is through the fees that get paid in.
Great, thank you all. We had a question submitted via email ahead of the panel this morning, and it's speaking about closures. The Pacific Southwest region just temporarily closed more than half of its national forests until late September. Longer running closures are becoming a common occurrence. What factors go into closure decisions, and how can we as advocates, stakeholders, partner organizations support the agency and avert the need for blanket closures?
And is funding up to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm in a position to answer that question, Melinda. I think I would need my boss to go into that more.
Okay.
So I can try to get some feedback to send out, but at this time, I don't know that. I think I should probably leave that to the folks who made the decisions.
Fair enough. And we've got a couple more direct, more kind of questions specific to panelists that I might just connect you all via email afterwards, because I think they could get a little bit more drilled down into certain details. So I think for now, if anybody has any more questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. But is there anything else that we haven't touched on, panelists, that you wanted us to get to?
Okay.
I don't think so.
Good. Well done. Well-oiled machine. Really fascinating, really complex topic. As Erin said, super interconnected, so many different sources, so many different ways to try to influence those sources. But do stay tuned to our channels and to the Mountaineers and to Resources Legacy Fund. Reach out to Mike. We're going to continue to be working on this. This is a real high priority for us. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the panel for taking the time and sharing your expertise and experience. And thank you to all attendees for being here. I wish, again, that we could see you in the break here. Please do go take a break for an hour or so. Come back in an hour. We'll be talking about ski area expansions. We're tracking quite a few of them, talking about the process for engaging in that, how that process works, what those impacts are to wildlands and to local communities. Exciting stuff. And again, all of these panels are recorded and will be posted, and please do share those with your colleagues and friends and within your networks. Great discussions. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you all back here in an hour.
Thank you.